Every mountain man who worked the Rocky Mountains in the 1820s carried a knife on his belt. You already knew that. The belt knife is in every painting, every museum display, every Hollywood Western ever made about the fur trade. What nobody knew, or at least what almost nobody talks about, is that most of them carried a second one hidden where you would never think to look. Tucked inside the leather legging, strapped against the calf, or slipped down near the top of a moccasin, sat a small fixed blade with no name anyone bothered to write down. It had no brand, no manufacturer's stamp, no place in the mythology of the American West. You will not find it listed in a single trading post inventory from the period. It does not appear in the famous Alfred Jacob Miller paintings of the 1837 Rendezvous. No museum west of the Mississippi has a placard for it. And yet, in the moments that actually decided whether a trapper lived or died, whether he walked out of a grizzly bear attack or bled out alone on the bank of some river nobody had named yet, this was the blade that mattered. It was called the legging knife, and history forgot it. This is the story of a weapon so effective that everyone who carried one survived by it, and so humble that nobody thought to give it a chapter. By the end, you will understand why the most important knife on the frontier was the one you could not see. St. Louis, 1822. A man named William Henry Ashley placed a newspaper advertisement looking for enterprising young men willing to travel up the Missouri River and into the Rocky Mountains to trap beaver. The pelts were worth $4 to $6 a pound, a small fortune at the time, and the fashion houses of London and Paris were paying top dollar for beaver felt hats. Ashley pulled together roughly 100 men. They were farmers, drifters, blacksmiths, a few former sailors. Some of them would become legends. Jim Bridger was 19 years old. Jedediah Smith was 23. Hugh Glass was already pushing 40, old by frontier standards. These men were about to walk into some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent. No roads, no resupply, no law. The nearest doctor, the nearest blacksmith, the nearest anything that resembled civilization could be over 1,000 miles of mountains, rivers, and open prairie away. Winters dropped to 40 below. Grizzly bears stood 9 feet tall and could outrun a horse over short distances. The Blackfoot, Arikara, and other nations controlled vast stretches of the territory and had their own reasons for not wanting trappers there. In June of 1823, the Arikara attacked Ashley's party on the Missouri River, killed 15 men, and wounded 11 others, including Hugh Glass, who took a ball in the leg. This was the business. Death was the overhead cost. The tools they carried on their bodies were the only things standing between them and a death that could come from a dozen directions. Every ounce mattered because every ounce had to be carried on horseback or on foot through mountain passes that could kill a man by exposure alone. So what did a mountain man actually carry? Osborne Russell, a trapper who kept one of the most detailed journals of the era, listed the typical loadout: 1 animal to ride, a saddle, 6 beaver traps, a blanket, moccasins, a powder horn and bullet pouch, and on the belt, a butcher knife. That belt knife did everything. It skinned beaver, it cut meat, it scraped hides, it split kindling. And when a trapper's flintlock rifle gave him 1 shot and then became a 5-foot club, the belt knife was his only real weapon at close range. The knife types most common in the fur trade were the butcher knife, the scalping knife, and the trade knife. These 3 names appear over and over in period ledger books, journals, and trading post records. The terms were used loosely and often interchangeably. A butcher knife had a broad blade, usually 5 to 8 inches, meant for heavy cutting work. A scalping knife was thinner, lighter, designed for precision work on hides and, yes, occasionally for the grim task the name implies. A trade knife was simply any blade manufactured specifically for the fur trade market and used as currency in exchanges with native peoples. Most of these knives, before the 1830s, came from the knife-making guilds of Sheffield, England. Sheffield blades were the gold standard for consistent quality. The cutlers there had been refining their craft for centuries, and the steel they produced held an edge through weeks of hard use in the field. American blacksmiths forged knives too, hammering them out of old files and rasps, but their products were hit or miss. A frontier-forged blade might be brilliant, or it might snap on the first cold morning. There was no way to know until it was too late. It was not until John Russell founded his Green River Works in Greenfield, Massachusetts, around 1834, that an American manufacturer could match Sheffield on a consistent basis. Russell set up his factory on the Green River, a small stream in western Massachusetts, not the Green River in Wyoming where the rendezvous were held. The distinction matters because even the origin of the name carries a myth inside it. The factory eventually shipped close to 60,000 knives per year westward, a staggering number for the era. The name Green River became frontier slang for quality itself. Anything done up to Green River meant first-rate work. The phrase came from the manufacturer's stamp on the blade, pressed near the handle, and the grimmer version, stabbing a man up to the Green River, meant sinking the blade all the way to the hilt. But here is a detail most people overlook when they talk about mountain man knives. The belt knife was visible, obvious, worn in a leather sheath on the hip or thrust behind the belt where anyone could see it. And in the world of the mountain man, where a fight could start at a rendezvous gambling table or erupt on a riverbank when two trapping parties disputed territory, having your only blade in plain sight meant your opponent knew exactly what you were working with. So the trappers carried a second knife, sometimes a third, and the most interesting of these was the one they hid. The legging knife was not a specific manufactured product. You would never find it listed in a trading post inventory under that name. It was a practice, a custom, a piece of frontier survival logic that the mountain men borrowed, adapted, and refined from the native peoples they lived alongside. To understand how it worked, you have to understand what the mountain men were wearing. Forget the cowboy image, forget the denim and the cowboy boots and the wide-brimmed hat. That world came later. These men did not dress like characters from a John Wayne film. A trapper's clothing, especially after his store-bought cotton and wool wore out in the first season, was made from animal hides. Buckskin shirts, leather breeches, and leggings. Mountain man leggings were separate garments tied to a belt or a leather thong at the waist and extending down each leg. They were not pants. Each leg was its own piece. Think of them as individual leather tubes, open at the top and bottom, held in place by the waist ties and by the friction of the leather against the body. The buckskin was soft, supple, tanned by hand using techniques most trappers learned from native women. Fringe ran along the outside seam, and the fringe was not just decoration. It served as a wick to draw water off the leather when the trapper waded through mountain streams to set traps. It also served as an emergency repair kit, since individual strands could be cut off and used as lashing material. Indigenous peoples across the continent had worn this style of legging for centuries. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Blackfoot, all of them wore buckskin leggings adapted to their own climate and terrain. Most trappers adopted the style within their first year in the mountains because it was practical, durable, and easy to repair in the field with nothing more than a sharp knife and a piece of scrap leather. This construction created a natural hiding spot, and the trappers noticed. A small fixed-blade knife, usually 3 to 4 inches of blade, could be slipped into a rawhide or leather sheath sewn directly to the inside of the legging, or simply tucked between the leather and the leg. Some trappers kept theirs near the top of their moccasins, which reached partway up the calf. Others strapped the sheath to a leather thong tied around the calf beneath the legging. The knife was invisible from the outside. Fringe on the legging helped break up any outline. The soft leather conformed around the sheath, and the blade left no hard edges visible through the garment. And the position was chosen for a very specific tactical reason. A trapper could reach it with either hand in a grapple, even if his belt knife had been knocked away or his arms were pinned from the front. When you are flat on your back, a knife on your hip is underneath you. A knife on your calf is right there. This was not a gentleman's concealed weapon. This was not some romantic notion of a hidden dagger. This was a survival tool born from a very specific and terrifying reality. In the Rocky Mountains between 1820 and 1840, a man could find himself in a fight for his life with almost no warning. A grizzly bear could charge out of a berry thicket and be on him in 3 seconds. His single-shot flintlock rifle was gone after one pull of the trigger, and reloading took at least 30 seconds, a process involving a powder horn, a ball, a ramrod, and steady hands. In a bear charge, he did not have 30 seconds. He had maybe 2. His belt knife might get knocked loose in the initial impact, or the sheath might be pinned between his body and the ground. And now he was down, 800 pounds of animal on top of him, claws raking through buckskin and flesh, jaws closing on whatever they could find. If he had a legging knife, he could reach down past the chaos, pull the blade, and start cutting. 3 inches of steel in the right spot at the right second was the difference between a survival story and a shallow grave nobody would ever find. The most famous survival story of the entire fur trade era proves exactly why that backup mattered. In August of 1823, Hugh Glass was scouting ahead of Andrew Henry's trapping party near the forks of the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. Glass walked into a thicket and stumbled directly onto a mother grizzly with 2 cubs. The bear charged immediately. Glass fired his rifle into her chest, but the single shot did not stop her. She slammed him to the ground and began mauling him. She ripped his scalp loose from his skull. She tore open his back, exposing the bones of his rib cage. She broke his leg. She punctured his throat. Glass fought back with his knife, stabbing the bear over and over with whatever arm he could still move. His companions arrived and fired until the grizzly dropped. It took 3 men to roll the dead bear off of him. What they found underneath was barely recognizable as a living person. Andrew Henry's men were certain Glass would be dead by morning. He was not. He lasted the night, and the morning after, and the one after that. The party could not stay. They were in hostile territory, and every day they waited made them a bigger target. Henry offered a cash bounty for 2 volunteers to stay with Glass until he died and give him a proper burial. John Fitzgerald and a young Jim Bridger took the job. After several days, with Glass somehow still breathing, Fitzgerald and Bridger made a decision that would haunt frontier legend for 2 centuries. They took his rifle, his knife, his tomahawk, his fire-making kit. They took everything, and they left. Glass woke up alone. No weapons, no tools, no way to make fire. A broken leg, a body held together by willpower and scab tissue, and more than 200 miles of open wilderness between him and the nearest trading post at Fort Kiowa. His throat was punctured, his back was open to the ribs, his scalp hung loose. He had nothing but the ragged clothes on his body and the ground underneath him, and he crawled. For roughly 6 weeks, Hugh Glass dragged himself across the Dakota Plains, moving south and east toward the Missouri River. He ate buffalo berries when he could find them. He ate roots. He ate insects. He killed a rattlesnake by pinning it with a rock and pounded the raw meat until it was soft enough to chew and swallow through his ruined throat. When maggots infested his wounds, he let them feed because they consumed the dead tissue that would have turned to gangrene and killed him. He set his own broken leg using whatever sticks and scraps he could find. He wrapped himself in the grizzly bear's own hide, the one his companions had meant to bury him in. Glass navigated by landmarks like Thunder Butte, dragging his body across open badlands, river breaks, and prairie grass. He scavenged buffalo meat that wolves had left behind. He drank from streams and springs. Every mile was earned with pain that most people cannot imagine. When Glass reached the Cheyenne River, he somehow obtained a crude hide boat, likely from friendly Lakota, who found him along the bank. He floated downstream toward the Missouri. By mid-October of 1823, Hugh Glass limped into Fort Kiowa, alive. The men at the trading post did not recognize the thing that walked through the gate. The story became a legend in its own time. It was published in a Philadelphia journal just 2 years later and spread across the country. It was retold around every campfire in the Rockies. And 2 centuries later, it became the basis for a film that won Leonardo DiCaprio an Academy Award. Now, the historical record does not specifically confirm what kind of backup blade Glass may or may not have had on him during the attack. His companions took his knife and rifle, that much is documented. But the story illustrates something that every trapper in the mountains understood on a gut level. When you are on the ground with a grizzly, the weapon on your belt may already be gone. The weapon under your legging is still there. Every man who heard the Glass story and then walked into Grizzly country the following spring carried a backup, and the legging was the best place to put it. While all of this was happening on the American frontier, a parallel knife tradition was developing in the wider culture, and it would ultimately overshadow the legging knife entirely. In 1827, 4 years after the Glass attack, a man named James Bowie got into what became known as the sandbar fight near Natchez, Mississippi. What started as a formal duel between two other men turned into a chaotic brawl involving roughly a dozen participants, pistols, swords, and cane knives. Bowie was shot twice, stabbed once, and beaten over the head with a pistol butt. He still managed to kill one of his attackers and wound another with a large knife that, depending on which account you trust, was either made by his brother Resin or forged by the Arkansas blacksmith James Black. The Bowie knife became an overnight sensation. Newspapers from Philadelphia to New Orleans covered it. Knife makers across America and in Sheffield, England, started producing copies. By the early 1830s, references to Bowie knives appear in fur trade journals, meaning the trend reached the mountains within just a few years. The Bowie knife was big, dramatic. It had a heavy clip-point blade, sometimes 10 to 15 inches long, with a brass guard and a grip designed to fill the whole hand. It was a weapon built to impress and intimidate, and it looked spectacular hanging from a belt. Within a decade, it became the iconic frontier blade, the knife that showed up in paintings, dime novels, political cartoons, and eventually in every Hollywood Western ever made. The legging knife was the opposite of all of this. Small, hidden, no name attached to a famous fight, no newspaper coverage, no legend at all. While the Bowie knife was being celebrated in print from coast to coast, the legging knife was quietly doing its job in the backcountry, in places where the only audience was the man whose life it saved and the animal or enemy it saved him from. If you're finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover forgotten corners of history every week. By the early 1840s, the world that had created the legging knife was dying, and nobody saw it coming fast enough to save what they knew. The annual rendezvous had been the heartbeat of the fur trade since William Ashley organized the first one on the Green River in 1825. Every summer, trappers who had spent the year scattered across the mountains in groups of 2 or 3 would converge at a prearranged meeting point. Supply trains from St. Louis brought goods: wool blankets, gunpowder, lead, beads, coffee, sugar, whiskey. The trappers traded their beaver pelts for supplies and credit. They raced horses, held shooting contests, gambled, fought, drank, and told stories. The rendezvous was where knowledge was transferred, including the practical survival tricks like where to carry a backup blade. It was the classroom of the mountains, and it had no walls and no written curriculum. Then the market collapsed. Beaver felt hats fell out of fashion in Europe, replaced by silk top hats. The price of beaver pelts dropped from $4 to $6 a pound to $1 or $2. The beaver themselves were trapped nearly to extinction in many watersheds. By 1840, maybe 50 to 75 trappers remained working in the Rockies, a fraction of the 500 or 600 who had roamed the mountains a decade earlier. The last rendezvous was held in 1840 on the Green River in Wyoming. The era was over, and as the mountain men scattered, some becoming Army Scouts, some settling into ranching, some disappearing into the mountains for good, the culture they had built went with them. The oral traditions, the survival customs, the small practical details of how they lived and what they carried started to fade. What replaced the mountain man in the American imagination was the cowboy. And the cowboy carried a revolver. Samuel Colt had patented his first revolving pistol in 1836, and by the 1850s, the six-shooter was the weapon of the frontier. The close-quarters knife fight, the grapple on the ground, the desperate reach for a hidden blade, all of that belonged to an older, rougher world. The Bowie knife survived the transition because it was flashy enough to become a cultural symbol. The Green River knife survived because its manufacturer kept making them for decades, and the phrase "up to Green River" had entered the language. But the legging knife had no manufacturer, no catchphrase, and no champion. It was a practice, not a product. And practices die with the people who practice them. There is one more reason the legging knife disappeared from frontier history, and it has nothing to do with the knife itself. The men who wrote the early histories of the West, the journalists and novelists and painters who shaped how America understood its own frontier, were not interested in small, practical, hidden tools. They wanted drama. They wanted the Hawken rifle and the Bowie knife and the lone trapper silhouetted against a mountain sunset. The legging knife did not fit that narrative. It was too quiet, too modest, too close to the ground. Alfred Jacob Miller, the artist who traveled to the 1837 rendezvous and painted the most detailed visual record of the mountain men that exists, shows trappers with large belt knives and tomahawks in plain view. The small blades tucked out of sight do not make the paintings. They are not dramatic enough. The academic historians who came later, men like Leroy Hafen, who compiled the 10-volume Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, focused on biographical sketches and business records. Ledger books tracked butcher knives, scalping knives, and trade knives by the dozen. The legging knife was not a line item. It was a personal choice, a custom carried in leather and memory. So the record went silent, and the blade went with it. But the idea never died. Not really. The principle behind the legging knife, a small concealed backup blade kept where it can be reached when the primary weapon fails, shows up in every generation of fighting men after the mountain men disappeared. Confederate cavalrymen in the Civil War carried boot knives. Soldiers in both world wars strapped small fixed blades to their calves under their trousers. The modern military concept of a last-ditch knife, a compact blade carried in a secondary location on the body, follows the exact same logic that a trapper on the Grand River worked out 200 years ago. Today's boot knives and ankle-carry fixed blades are direct descendants of the same idea. A small blade, 3 to 5 inches, hidden against the lower leg, accessible in a grapple or a ground fight. The materials have changed. The steel is better. The sheaths use modern retention clips and kydex molds instead of rawhide thongs and hand-stitched leather. But the concept is identical. Carry a backup where nobody expects it, because the moment you need it most is the moment everything else has already gone wrong. Modern knife carriers call it a secondary or a last-ditch blade. Special operations soldiers carry them. Law enforcement officers carry them. Wilderness guides working in grizzly country carry them. The terminology is different, the gear catalogs are glossy, and the price tags are higher. But every single one of these carriers is following a doctrine that was worked out by a beaver trapper in leather pants 200 years ago. The mountain men figured this out the hard way, in a world where getting it wrong meant dying alone in a canyon 2,000 miles from the nearest doctor. They did not write manuals about it. They did not patent the design. They did not give it a catchy name or sell it at a rendezvous. They just tucked a blade into their legging and walked into the mountains. The real question is not why we forgot the legging knife. It is what else we have forgotten. The fur trade era lasted barely 20 years. In that time, roughly 1,000 men walked into the Rocky Mountains and tried to make a living pulling beaver out of freezing streams. Many of them died. The ones who survived did so because of small, unglamorous decisions: where to camp, when to move, which direction to face while sleeping, and what to carry where nobody could see it. The Green River knife got a phrase. The Bowie knife got a legend. The Hawken rifle got a place in every museum west of the Mississippi. The legging knife got nothing. Just the quiet knowledge, passed from one trapper to the next, that when everything goes wrong, you reach for the blade nobody knows about. If this story caught you by surprise, the video on screen covers another piece of frontier history that slipped through the cracks. Click it now.